Some realizations do not arrive when a person is looking for them. They arrive when the heart becomes too honest to keep pretending. Your soulmate may be entering one of those seasons now. For a long time, they believed that caring deeply meant caring more. If someone became distant, they tried harder. If communication became difficult, they found another way to keep things together. If someone stopped showing the same level of interest, they convinced themselves there had to be a reason. They were patient, understanding, forgiving, sometimes even when their own heart was quietly asking for something different. They called it loyalty. They called it love. They called it giving someone time. But recently, a different understanding has begun forming inside them. They are realizing that love cannot survive forever on the strength of one person's effort. This realization did not come from a dramatic ending. It came through observation. They began noticing how different relationships made them feel after every interaction. Some left them energized. Some left them questioning themselves. Some made them feel appreciated without having to ask. Others made them wonder whether their presence was even noticed. That contrast became impossible to ignore. One evening, they were having a conversation with someone close to them. They noticed themselves doing something familiar. They were listening carefully, asking questions, trying to understand the other person's perspective. Then they suddenly realized something. Nobody had asked how they were doing. It was such a small thing, yet it created a deep silence inside them. They understood that they had become so accustomed to giving emotional attention that they rarely noticed when it was not being returned. That moment stayed with them. Later that night, they began thinking about their past. How often had they mistaken patience for waiting indefinitely? How often had they called emotional distance timing? How many times had they explained someone's lack of effort instead of simply acknowledging it? These questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary, because emotional maturity sometimes begins when a person stops creating excuses for situations that consistently leave their heart empty. Your soulmate started recognizing a pattern. They had been afraid that asking for reciprocity would make them appear demanding, so they asked for less, then even less, until eventually they became comfortable receiving almost nothing. They thought they were being understanding. Now they realized they were slowly teaching themselves that their needs did not matter. That realization changed something important. They began separating love from self-abandonment. They understood that loving someone does not mean constantly ignoring what you need. Being patient does not mean accepting endless uncertainty. Being compassionate does not mean carrying an entire relationship alone. And caring deeply does not mean becoming responsible for another person's emotional choices. This new perspective also changed how they remembered your connection. There was something different about the moments they shared with you. They remembered times when conversation felt balanced, when both people listened, when attention moved naturally in both directions, when they could speak about something personal without feeling as though they had to compete for emotional space. Those moments may have seemed ordinary at the time. Now they understand their value, because reciprocity is often easiest to recognize after experiencing its absence. They began remembering the little things, the way a conversation could continue without one person doing all the work, the way understanding could happen without endless explanations, the way simple attention could make them feel genuinely seen. Those memories did not create desperation. They created perspective. They showed them what they actually wanted from love. Not constant attention, not perfection, not someone who agreed with everything they said. Something much simpler, mutual presence. They wanted to know that if they reached toward someone emotionally, that person would sometimes reach back. They wanted conversations where both people were curious about each other's inner world. They wanted affection that was freely expressed rather than constantly requested. And most importantly, they wanted a relationship where neither person had to wonder whether they mattered. This realization began changing their standards, not in a cold way, in a healthy way. They were no longer impressed by temporary intensity. They were paying attention to consistency. They were no longer measuring love by how strongly someone spoke. They were watching how reliably someone showed up. They were learning that beautiful words can create emotion for a moment, but consistent actions create trust over time. That lesson reached directly into their understanding of your connection. They began wondering whether the reason certain memories remained meaningful was because they represented a kind of balance they had not fully appreciated before. Perhaps they had not understood the value of mutual effort when they were living through those moments. Perhaps they only recognized it after experiencing relationships where effort constantly moved in one direction. Now they could see the difference, and that difference was changing them. They were becoming more comfortable with the idea that healthy love should not require one person to constantly chase the other. It should not require someone to repeatedly prove their importance. It should not make one heart feel as though it has to earn basic consideration. Love can be patient, but it should also be present. Love can survive distance, but it should still contain intention. Love can move through difficult seasons, but both people have to care enough to participate. That understanding has quietly become one of the most important lessons of their emotional journey, and perhaps they are finally ready to live by it. As this understanding continued settling into their heart, your soulmate began seeing relationships with a maturity they had never experienced before. They finally understood that reciprocity does not mean two people will always behave in exactly the same way. People have different personalities, different responsibilities, different ways of expressing affection. Sometimes one person speaks more. Sometimes the other needs more time. Sometimes one person reaches out first, and sometimes the other carries more emotional weight during a difficult season. That alone does not make love unequal. What matters is intention. Both people must care enough to participate. Both must notice when the other is struggling. Both must value the connection enough to protect it. That distinction gave your soulmate a completely new understanding of love. They stopped looking for perfect symmetry. Instead, they started looking for genuine willingness. Someone may not always know the right thing to say, but do they try? Someone may not express affection in exactly the same way, but do they make their care visible? Someone may need space, but do they eventually return to the conversation? These questions became more meaningful than temporary displays of emotion. For the first time, your soulmate understood that consistency does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like remembering something important. Sometimes it looks like checking in. Sometimes it means listening when there is nothing they can personally gain from the conversation. Sometimes it means saying, "I don't completely understand, but I want to." That kind of effort began to matter more to them than grand gestures ever had, and naturally their thoughts returned to your connection. They started remembering moments that carried this kind of quiet reciprocity. Maybe it was a simple conversation where both of you shared something personal. Maybe it was a moment when one of you needed understanding and the other simply stayed present. Maybe it was a small act that seemed insignificant at the time. Now those moments felt different. They could finally recognize the emotional value behind them. Your connection had not been meaningful because everything was always easy. It had been meaningful because there were moments when both hearts seemed willing to meet somewhere in the middle. That memory brought them a sense of appreciation, but it also brought self-reflection. They began wondering where they had personally failed to meet others halfway. They remembered times when someone had tried to understand them while they were too distracted by their own fears to notice. They remembered opportunities to communicate that they had allowed to disappear. They remembered moments when pride had been louder than affection. This did not create guilt. It created responsibility. They began understanding that emotional maturity is not simply knowing what you want from another person. It is also becoming capable of offering those same qualities yourself. If they wanted honesty, they needed to practice honesty. If they wanted consistency, they needed to become consistent. If they wanted emotional safety, they needed to create safety too. That realization changed the way they prepared for future love. They no longer wanted to be someone waiting to receive everything. They wanted to become someone capable of giving without losing themselves. That balance mattered, because they had finally discovered the difference between generosity and self-neglect. Generosity says, I want to share what I have. Self-neglect says, I must keep giving even when I have nothing left. They never wanted to confuse the two again. As their self-awareness grew, they also became more comfortable recognizing when a connection was not healthy for them. They no longer believed every relationship had to be saved. Some connections could be appreciated for what they taught and then released with respect. That understanding created space for something more meaningful. A relationship where neither person had to constantly convince the other to care. A relationship where affection could be expressed freely. A relationship where difficult conversations were not automatically treated as threats. A relationship where both people could say, this matters to me, and know the other person would listen. That is the kind of love your soulmate now understands differently. It is not about being pursued every second. It is not about receiving endless reassurance. It is about knowing that when life becomes complicated, both hearts still remember that the connection matters. This new understanding has also softened their view of the past. They no longer blame themselves for not knowing everything earlier. They recognize that emotional wisdom is something people develop through experience. The person they were before could only make choices from the awareness they had at that time. Now they know more. They feel more. They understand themselves better. And because of that, they can approach love differently. Perhaps that is why your connection still carries a quiet significance in their heart. It represents a possibility they once did not know how to appreciate fully. A relationship where love does not need to be chased, where interest does not need to be guessed, where communication does not have to feel like a struggle for attention, where both people can remain independent while still choosing each other intentionally. That is the kind of connection they are beginning to value, and perhaps the most beautiful part is that they are not simply waiting for someone else to provide it. They are becoming capable of creating it too. Their heart is learning that love is not proven by how much one person can endure. It is revealed by how willingly two people participate, how carefully they listen, how honestly they communicate, how respectfully they handle differences, and how consistently they remind each other, you don't have to carry this alone. That is the lesson your soulmate seems to be carrying into this new chapter. They no longer want love that survives only because one person refuses to give up. They want love where both people choose to stay engaged, not because they are afraid of losing each other, but because they genuinely value what they have. And perhaps that is what makes this transformation so meaningful. They are no longer asking, will someone love me enough to stay? They are beginning to ask, can I build a relationship where both hearts freely choose to stay? That is a much deeper question, and it comes from a much healthier heart. Whatever the future holds, this realization will remain part of who they are becoming. They have learned that love is not measured by who gives the most. It is measured by whether both people are willing to give something real. Not perfectly, not constantly, but sincerely. And when two people learn that lesson, love stops feeling like a pursuit. It becomes a partnership, a place where both hearts can speak, both can listen, both can grow, and both can finally know that they are not the only ones trying to keep the connection alive.